Good morning, everyone. People are joining us. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have quite a few folks registered, but we also have folks who sometimes just listen to the recordings and are not always here with us in person. We are very glad to have you with us, especially as Partners in Health and Wholeness continues to find ways to talk about faith and health and the intersection of faith and health. And talk about ways in which we can think about care of creation as people of faith and what that looks like to be engaged in the communities where we live and work and play. And we are very excited to have Dr. Stan Meberg with us today. And then we have some other PHW folks on the call. And so I think how we're going to start this morning is I'm just saying welcome to everyone. And then we are going to have just kind of a centering moment, a kind of meditative moment. And I already put it in the chat for some of the folks who were in the waiting room. We're going to open with a poem by Mary Oliver today. And I thought it was a very fitting. That poem in particular is called Praying. And so we're going to open with that today. Let me see, I'm going to put it in the chat just so everybody can see it. Praying. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. And the reason I chose that poem in particular for our centering today is that I think there are times when just being in the environment in which we live, whether it's weeds in a parking lot, whether it's trees in the woods, whether it's a river or a stream, whether it's looking at the sky, I think sometimes there are moments when we can stop long enough to remember that we are a part of whole ecosystems, that we are not just individuals by ourselves, but that we're all connected. And so that's one of the things I want you to keep in mind today as we're listening to Stan share with us, which I'm very excited about. And I also want folks to be thinking about what it looks like to advocate for greater care for our communities and what that means for health, mental health, our physical health, our spiritual health, all those sorts of intersections, and what it looks like when environment is compromised and people's lives aren't filled with thriving anymore because of the environment in which they live. So without further ado, Stan.
Well, Nicole, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with the Partners in Health and Wholeness this morning. And so I thought I would start by just simply sharing a couple of thoughts. I'll share a little bit about my background and where I'm from, and then talk about the 3 points that were in the announcement about this event that went out, in the theory that if I was going to address those 3 questions, probably the best way to do that was to actually address them, and then open it up for questions and discussion. So thank you all for joining us. And I want to give a particular shout out to Carl Siegel, who I saw pop up on the screen, because Carl is my great colleague with the here in the Diocese of North Carolina on the Commission on the Environment. So and Carl, boy, for those of you who know Carl, you probably know this, but there is no one in North Carolina who's been more effective than he and his colleagues at his congregation in Raleigh in moving forward the notion of sustainability in our activities as people of faith. But let me just tell a little bit about my story and how this came to be. And my story, no more than anybody else's story, my story doesn't define me, but it gives some context for the kind of perspective that I have to bring, and also ties back into North Carolina, because I am the son of a Baptist seminary professor who was a professor of pastoral care. Both my mother and my father were from, my father was from Clemson, South Carolina, and my mother was from the Hickory, North Carolina area down to Rock Hill, South Carolina, that they moved around some when she was a child. And my grandfather was the pharmacist in Clemson for many years. And my grandfather on the other side worked in the Navy and got the Spanish flu and had to go up to the mountains of North Carolina, where he met my grandmother, and then worked as a mechanic in central North Carolina until he went back into the CCC during the Depression, and eventually was involved with the Forest Service for a while. Then after the war was a mechanic again. So that's kind of their different background. But Dad was at the North Carolina Baptist Hospital School of Pastoral Care from 1957 to 1964. So that was my first encounter with Winston-Salem, where I live now. And from there, he went to Crozer Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania from 1964 to 1970. And Crozer is largely remembered now because it was one of the alma maters of Dr. Martin Luther King, who was there long before my father was. But it is a noteworthy and sometimes overlooked phase in Dr. King's journey. Well, Crozer merged with the Colgate Rochester Divinity School in 1970. So we moved up to Rochester, and Dad was there from 1970 to 1975, then came back down to Southeastern Baptist Seminary as the dean from 1975 to 1982, and taught at Southeastern through 1992, then retired and taught further in pastoral care at Gardner Webb and Campbell Divinity Schools until 2005. So Dad was very active in the pastoral care community and in the formation of the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. And in the days when that was still a very much cutting edge thing, he was a student of a professor named Dr. Wayne Oates, who was a Wake Forest graduate and became familiar for coining the term confessions of a workaholic. But it was in the days when clinical pastoral education wasn't as integrated into seminary curriculums as it is now. My own faith journey, though, departed from my parents, in that I affiliated with the Episcopal Church starting in 1973 and have been since then in the dioceses of North Carolina, Maryland, Texas, Atlanta, Washington again up at the cathedral, and now back in North Carolina after this long journey. And that's why I was particularly glad to see Carl, and have been active with environmental activities in both the Diocese of Atlanta and now here. And most of my professional life, even though I'm at Wake Forest now as a director of graduate studies and sustainability, but most of my professional life, almost 40 years, was at the Environmental Protection Agency, starting in 1977 and in a variety of places around the country, from Washington to Research Triangle Park to Dallas to Atlanta and back to Washington. So that was I was very fortunate in that journey. So all of those things have shaped the perspectives that I have on this question of being caretakers of creation. It was funny when I was hired here, just to tell a story, that some of you may have known Gail O'Day, who was the dean of the Divinity School when I was hired. And when they were interviewing me, I went into an interview with Dr. O'Day, and she said, and I was telling her about what my background was, and she looks at me and says, "Well, at least I don't have to explain to you what a seminary is." So any of you who knew Dr. O'Day knew that she could be very direct, and we miss her terribly. So to the first question was, what does it mean to be caretakers of creation when we ourselves are a part of creation? And where do we start when we know that the environments in which we live greatly impact the health of our communities? And which, of course, is a very good question, and I can't do justice to the answer, but I had a few thoughts. And the first one is that that yes, we are a part of creation. We are not apart from creation, sort of to Nicole's point in her poem. We are in this. It is not the creation and ourselves. We are a part of it. And environments have always affected health. And you need to go back no further than to look at all the biblical stories of floods, famines, and plagues to sort of illustrate this point. And health plays a strong role in faith stories, stories of healing lepers, for example. This is a really important part of the Christian story. And to the ancient writers, health was a way in which you were always looking for evidence or signs of God at work in the world. Just the sign, people would attribute health or lack of health to some sort of divine intention, or to look for signs, other signs, the rainbow sign. And this is a covenant that God would not arbitrarily destroy the world. And it would seem that the flip side of that is that our part of that covenant is that we would not arbitrarily destroy the world. And so God's kind of done God's part. And the question we face now is, what about us? That if we think of ourselves as God's hands at work in the world, does that not seem to be a sacred responsibility? And then you come back to this question that we are a part of creation, and that we know, as the sacred writers did, that we depend on creation. And in fact, you can go so far as to say that we are co-creators as part of this process. And the ancient writers also understood that our wisdom in caring for creation, or our lack of wisdom in caring for creation, can be the difference between life and death. You think, for example, about the planning of Joseph for the years of famine. There was a divine revelation, but the revelation wouldn't mean anything unless Joseph said, okay, that means we got to go do this. And Pharaoh, you got to store up these 7 years of grain in your grain houses so that when the famine comes, you'll be ready. Makes the difference between life and health, or life and death, really. And so that shows that wisdom, it has to be manifested not just by revelation, but also by action in the world to bring it about. And theologically, and I am no theologian, but theologically, this is in some ways kind of frightening, because it means that we have the powers of creation and destruction in our own hands. So think about that for a minute, in our own hands. My son has said, in response to those who deny the reality of our changing climate, he says, nature doesn't care what you think. And while he's sort of right in a way, the fact of the matter is, though, that what we think can have a pretty profound impact on nature. When our thoughts and actions bring ecological disruption, or that we contribute to extreme weather events that put our most valuable populations at greatest risk. If you look at the increasing risks with rising populations of interactions with reservoirs of viruses in otherwise isolated ecosystems that can make the jump from animals to humans, as we just witnessed here in the last year and a half. Or you look at the impacts of exposures to chemicals that we depend on in this wonderful paradox. We depend on these chemicals for many of the conveniences of our daily life. And yet the byproducts of these chemicals can bring illness and death. So I guess, to me, to answer that question, the most useful place to start is in thinking about caring for creation, is to ask ourselves, are we doing things that affirm life? And that things occurs both at the personal level and also at systems level. And that's probably the most useful place for me to start. So Nicole, let me ask if I can do one or two things here. One is I can stop and we can have some dialogue around that, or I can go on to the other two questions, but maybe this is a good time to stop and have a little dialogue.
Okay, does anybody have any thoughts about what Stan has said so far, or have any questions in particular that might relate to kind of this first question about thinking about ourselves as both a part of creation and caretakers of creation, that we're not apart from it, but we are a part of it?
Thank you, Sarah. I see your comment. I really appreciate that.
And I think everybody should have the ability to be able to unmute themselves. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Yeah. So while you were talking, I will say that, so in your career, working at the EPA, when you were in discussions or thinking about different sorts of policies, do you feel like your faith played a role in helping you to think about those policies? I mean, did you think about them in the context of uh, life or death? Did you think about them in the context of caring for creation or not?
The answer, the answer is sometimes. I mean, I don't usually think about life or death. If you're thinking about what's the best way to organize the regional offices of EPA, that's probably not quite a life or death question, although it can be
Right.
momentous. But you, um, in the broadest sense, I always felt, although I would rarely articulate it this way in the office, that underlying the way in which I thought about policy issues was some sense of responsibility for creation, but that was in a very broad sense. And that one of the distinctions you tried to draw is trying to draw a difference between what I will call, for lack of a better distinction, a policy issue versus a moral issue. And that's really important when you're a government official, because there are many policy issues on which people of good faith can disagree on what a right policy should be. I'll use this as an example, is probably the difference between whether the ozone standard for air quality is 70 parts per trillion or 65 parts per trillion is probably at the end of the day not a moral issue. The differentiation about the impacts of those two levels is sufficiently refined that 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 there are good arguments really to go either way, and still as long as you're in keeping with the law and you're transparent about it, and that you have taken due account of the science you have available to make your discussions. There are very few policy issues where all of the science says this and none of it says that, and that's your choice. You wish when you're a policymaker that you had a case where 97% of all the scientific articles written actually took one side of an argument. But enough about climate change. Those don't come along very often. Usually that there is incomplete knowledge, and you have to make a decision based on the weight of evidence and what the law actually gives you the authority as an agency like EPA to do. People forget that EPA is like every aspect of the federal government, is a creature of enumerated powers. You can't just go into your office of EPA and say, oh, what are we going to do today in an unconstrained way? You have many different social constraints that are embodied in law, and the basic constitutional framework is any powers not expressly allocated to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. So you just can't do anything you want. You really have to have it. There's a whole structure in place for the things that you can do. But it is also, even having said all that, though, it is worth remembering that there is a moral component to decisions, and to be mindful of that more than anything I could point to said, oh, I did this action because I was coming from a faith tradition. Long answer to a short question.
No, thank you. Thank you. I mean, because some people of faith, especially when we're talking about, for example, climate change, I will say that it's not always easy for just everyday folks to like wrap their minds around. Sometimes you're hearing competing thoughts and ideas. And so what do you say when you're talking to people about climate change and in your church? How do you talk about that? How do you talk about that in the context of being a caretaker of creation? For somebody who might be like, I don't get it, and I don't think it's real anyways.
Well, the first thing you do is listen, because most people sort of if that's how the conversation started, then one thing you might do is say, tell me more. Tell me sort of on what leads you to this conclusion. And acknowledge that climate change is a tough issue, because in your day-to-day life, sometimes you can see it very immediately. For example, if you were a victim of extreme weather that's been exacerbated by a changing climate. But a lot of times we go about our lives and climate change seems like a sort of a very distant level of concern, in part because we feel disassociated from the cause and effect relationship. That, you mean by turning on the lights in my house, or running the air conditioner more, or driving my car, I'm actually going to create climate change? Really? It seems disproportionate. The act seems disproportionate to the consequences. And we have to get our minds around the fact that hundreds of millions of individual acts have consequences that should demonstrate that humankind can actually affect the globe. I mean, think of that. In our normal day-to-day lives, we don't really think of it that much. So that makes it a very hard issue to get your mind around. And to make matters worse, of course, you've had this association of climate with different political values. It's just like the politicization of wearing masks. You wouldn't think that that would be something to become a political statement, but in this wacky world we're in, it is. And so the first thing I do is try to listen, and then not to try to beat people over the head with facts to convince them. That's very rarely a successful advocacy or communication strategy. Most people need to feel that they have been heard before you can even create any openness to having a dialogue. And what I am saying is extraordinarily difficult to do right these days, because it requires you to be in relationship with a person. And that can be hard. I mean, how many of you have had family conversations about climate change where even within your family, it almost becomes the subject you don't talk about at Thanksgiving dinner? So it's I don't want to in any way, shape, or form minimize this. I do think there is cause for hope that the polling on this suggests that more and more people are in fact coming to recognize that climate change is a real phenomenon, and it's something we need to deal with, even if there are disagreements over particular policy prescriptions. But if you can shift the debate from, I don't need to pay attention to this, to, I guess I hadn't thought about that, I wonder what we should be doing. That's a massive shift right there. And that then you can help introduce the idea that just because that you can do things to help address the changing climate without having to put on a hair shirt and wear sackcloth and ashes. So, and simple things, simple ordinary things can make a difference. I gave a sermon once on the sort of the notion of the simple acts that everybody can undertake. It was an Easter season sermon about Jesus and the broiled fish, the story of the broiled fish, and just it was an ordinary, simple thing, and yet of great meaning. And that's what some of our actions on climate can be.
So, yep, sounds like somebody has a question.
Hello.
Hey, Carl, how are you?
Right, and your opening answer there was very helpful to me. Very often when I talk with people about climate change, I get one or two reactions. One of them is, "Oh, well, don't you know this is the way it's all going to end anyway? We're going to end up in a ball of fire. So this is all part of what's going to happen." This is and your perspective on we are co-creators and we can have an effect, I think, is very important. And getting around to having that effect, you were talking about how driving our car and other actions we take can contribute to climate change. What people have a really hard time understanding is the reverse, that by not driving their car or by making their house more energy efficient, that all of these things do add up. It is daunting to think about how are we going to meet emissions targets to keep our temperature below 1.5 degrees centigrade. But if we all start from that position that we can't have an effect, that's going to be the worst thing for us. We've in the mentality that both it's not I, it's we, and we have to be together in community working on this. And I think that's really the answer that you gave us, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Carl. That's very well said. It is, again, exactly as you said, to sort of repeat myself a bit, that we have to think of ourselves, not our individual actions are important, but they're important not only as statements of our own personal commitment, but also as a recognition that it is the corporate effect of millions of individual actions is extraordinarily powerful.
All right, so there is a question in the chat. How do we approach conversations with family or friends who say that the Earth's climate has always changed, so the human impact is not significant?
I think you have to separate the two parts of that statement. The first, the question about the Earth's climate has always changed. That's absolutely true. Over the course of the history of Earth, over billions of years, there have been significant swings all the way from a hothouse Earth to a snowball Earth. So this is true. There have been natural processes that have in fact affected the climate of the Earth. So that's all true. What is different about this time is the speed of change and the signature about where the change is coming from. You can't point to volcanic eruptions or shifts in tectonic plates or variations in thermal energy from the sun, all of which do not account for the signal that we are seeing about carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and the corresponding and related general rise in the temperature of the Earth over the last 100 years, which in geological time is nothing. It's nothing. So there's two. So the if-then part is where the disconnect in that statement is about human impact is not significant. Actually, it is to an astonishing degree, even given historical standards. We now have levels of carbon in the atmosphere we haven't seen since human beings have been around on the planet. And this, and you can trace those things back and draw relationships between the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and average global temperatures. And it's not so much a matter of saving the Earth. You know, the Earth, the Earth is going to be here. The question is ourselves. So that anyway, that I mean, but you again, but the real answer about conversation with family and friends still goes back to you have to listen first and help at least establish some. What do you tell me more about what you mean by that? And then get sort of dive down to the questions and not have any expectations that you have this snappy elevator soundbite answer that's going to make them say, "Oh, I had no idea." That's rarely going to happen. But to have people feel heard and listened to, and then create an openness to that most difficult of thing for all of us humans, and I'm no different from anybody else, that to the willingness to say, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that." That's really, that's a hard business. That's a hard business for any of us.
All right, there's another question. Do you think taking an approach connecting Earth health to human health is effective in shifting people's opinions and actions?
That's a great question, Karen, and it can be, because in fact, Gina McCarthy, who I had the great privilege of working next door to for about 2 some years, and boy, that's an interesting experience. Always made the point that she felt that people, it was one of those factors that enables people to hear about climate change in ways that they might not otherwise hear it. That it's one thing to think about climate change and think, oh, the terrible polar bear harm and this kind of thing, but to hear about what's going on that is changing the climate is also affecting your health and the health of people you love and communities that you really care about, which is true. And that framing of it that way will sometimes open people up to think about climate change in a different way than they might otherwise have done. And it's a hard thing to do because there is so much messaging around this issue, and it can kind of get lost in the noise. But in individual conversations, you think about this. And I actually published an article in one of the issues of the North Carolina Medical Journal, which talked about exactly this question. And there were a whole series of articles in this journal. It was, I think, in the fall of last year. And there's another one by Greg Carney, who works at East Carolina Medical School, about different impacts, whether it's tropical diseases or extreme weather or heat waves, and all of which have pretty you can really trace these things about how it does affect health. That's true on the larger environmental scale as well. The great debate going on now about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances and what kind of steps are appropriate to look after chemicals like the Gen X chemicals that have gotten so much attention in North Carolina. That these things exist because we collectively wanted them, because they made our lives better, because we had nonstick Teflon pans and Gore-Tex rain coating and things, all of which were made using these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So the question becomes, okay, is it worth it to be able to have this particular convenience and at the price of the externalities coming from the manufacture of these substances? Or to frame it in a better way, Do we have to do it this way? Is there not some other design or some other way of thinking about this that would give you some of the things you want, but not with the same externality, just external disbenefits, which is one of the best arguments for electric cars, apart from the fact that they're wicked fun to drive and they don't require any maintenance. But that's another story.
All right, so I have a question. So for folks who are going, well, what do I do as an individual? You talked a few minutes ago, about 10 minutes ago, about collective action, individual action, and how all those individual actions together are what has an impact. So what could individuals do? And then as a second part of that, what could a faith community do to talk about the environment and what they could actually do practically?
And I'll get to that on the sort of answering that question about what's most important in our advocacy efforts. But the faith community, I will say that one of the biggest challenges in our modern life is there is so little trust in institutions. Certainly in government, for sure. There was a story on NPR last night that said that business is the most trusted institution. I thought, really? But for people who are in faith communities, that's a very important sort of signal and role in their lives. So engaging in that conversation in faith communities with which you're a part and say, this is part of the faith journey, is thinking about this, that by itself is terribly important. And I suspect that there are many people on this call who are now doing that. And that part of the value is to sort of recognize what you are doing really matters. You may not see it on a day-to-day basis, but over time, that continued thought process and incorporating in this as, yes, this is a part of our faith journey, is tremendously important to echo support within a community of which you're already a community you trust, of which you're already a member, and to articulate that as part of that community's values. That's a big deal. But to get back to the advocacy part, the question was, how do we know what's most important in our advocacy efforts? And I'm sorry to report that the short answer is you usually don't know until later. And sort of at the time, you simply have to trust your judgment. And your judgment is, people's judgments are informed by their past experiences, and that you can sometimes spend too much time doubting yourself. So I think sort of trust, kind of like, I don't want to go all Jedi on you and say trust your feelings, but sometimes you do have to do that, and particularly because in the question of what is most important, one person's most important may not be the same as another person's most important, and there's great grounding for this in sacred texts. The reference to many gifts of the Spirit, and to use the gospel metaphor, the different parts of the body perform different functions, and the body works best when each part does what it's best suited for, and that produces a harmonious whole. So that's my sort of theological sense of it. But to be a little more down to earth, I found that there are a couple of questions on that advocacy question that are useful to ask. And the first is, do you know what you're trying to accomplish? And that may sound obvious, but and I don't mean, but when you dig into that a little bit, what are we trying to do here? Not just generally, but very specifically, what are we trying to do? And unless you really can answer that question, you can waste a lot of energy. Or as one of my mentors used to say, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So think about first, what is success? What is success? And if you succeeded, how would you know? So that's a good question to ask in advocacy. Then the second one is, what's your plan of action? And I don't mean to imply in this question that it means you have to have a completely, elaborately drawn out strategic plan. That's not what I'm talking about. And I use as my authority on this General George Marshall, who was the commander, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II. And Marshall was big on planning, but he also said that the plan itself is nothing. The plan is nothing. But the planning is everything, because it gets you to anticipate what might happen and to lay out a course of action. But you also have to be flexible enough and adapt to recognize that what you were trying to do in the first place ain't working. And that means you need to do something else and be flexible enough. But if you've done good planning, it helps you anticipate some of the contingencies. So that would be the second thing that's important in advocacy efforts. And then the third thing is to ask yourself, are you prepared to persist? Because there are not very many activities in human life that are successful the first time. And failure teaches lessons that are oftentimes more consequential than the lessons we learn from triumphs. So you have to be prepared to persist. You have to learn the lessons from failures and then try to make new mistakes the next time. And then finally, the other thing for advocacy, and this is something that that really good advocates understand this, is to avoid making the perfect the enemy of the good. It's okay if you can't do everything. If you only achieve 50% of your objectives, then, well, 50% is a lot better than nothing. And in the next effort, if you're starting from the 50% place instead of starting from the 0 place, that's a pretty good start. So don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Understand what you want to do, put together a plan for achieving it, persist, and then recognize that maybe you only got halfway there, but then you got halfway there. And so that's really important to do. So those are some of my reactions, Nicole, to your question. I hope that's helpful.
All right, so does anybody have any other questions? Please feel free to unmute yourselves, or again, you can put them in the chat. So one of the other questions I want to ask, what would you say are some of the most important sort of environmental issues in North Carolina today? Like we've had some, talk about climate change. I mean, out in Eastern North Carolina, there's, communities who are going, this what's been in my water and how's that affecting me, and where's the justice in this, because people didn't feel like they had any power, right? So what are some of the most important issues? And then we can do also a sort of a follow-up question. What about folks who question the policies that are being made and say, we don't feel like we have any power to make a difference? Like, how do I tell, I don't know, the EPA or the local state folks, like, this is affecting our communities in not good ways, and be able to make a difference?
I'll do what are important issues right first. I'm going to put aside climate change, because you're right, we've talked about that already, and I don't want to belabor the point. My own sense is right now the most important issues in North Carolina revolve around water. I don't mean that to diminish the importance of some of the other issues, especially localized exposures to levels of air pollution, but water across the state is a really big deal, and it's a big deal in several levels. It's a big deal on water as a essential component of ecosystems and ecosystem disruption, nutrient levels in fresh water that can create contamination in downstream lakes and in estuaries and things like that. It's also, of course, an issue of water supply. And North Carolina is a growing state, and there is a certain amount of competition. People used to think that in North Carolina, we didn't need to worry about that because we get a lot of rain and it's a wet state, and so there's going to be plenty of water around. Unlike the West, where they've been worried about water shortages for a long time. Well, because of our growth and the growing demand for this, there is some risk that if we don't plan effectively, we could find ourselves in a water shortage situation with competing demands for municipal uses, industrial uses, and ecosystem service uses, and agricultural uses. So there's sort of all these in some ways are in competition. It requires a lot of a lot of hard thinking in different river basins. I think there's 17 major river basins in North Carolina, and each one of them has their own particular nuances of what's a critical issue there. But that's one. Coupled with that is the issue of water infrastructure, and infrastructure is getting a lot of play right now, and for good reason. I think there was a wake-up call that occurred largely motivated by the Flint experience about how there are many drinking water systems around the country that really aren't quite up to snuff. And in North Carolina, there's an unusual situation because in some ways, small is beautiful may not be quite working for North Carolina in terms of water systems. There are many small communities who've got these individualized water systems without really the resources or the governance structure to be able to maintain them in ways that actually produce reliably clean water. There are other areas that do not have water service that should have had water service. And I'm thinking of one in particular. And we're on the cusp of a period when it looks like a lot of resources are going to be put into water infrastructure. How can this be done in ways that both provide service to communities that haven't had service, but also in a way that is sustainable in terms of governance, and that you shouldn't, in a small community, regard having your own sewage treatment plant as a sign of your intrinsic identity, like having your own high school. And the bonds can be that tight, and that's a real conversation that's going on around the state. There has been some shrinkage of the number of overall water systems, as some communities have recognized they just simply can't do it on their own and need to affiliate with another system for management purposes. But there's still a lot of communities where it is felt that the existence of your own water system and your own sewage treatment plant is like a sign of your basic identity, as opposed to a question of how can you provide the best service to citizens at a reasonable cost. So that's a big issue for North Carolina. Let's see. Now, the question of power is actually a very interesting one, and this is related actually to the question you asked about in the flyer about confronting the structural injustices that disproportionately affect historically marginalized communities. And the first thing is to say, yes, there is injustice. Yes, these are structurally marginalized communities. We have a heavy legacy to bear, and people who look like me have an especially heavy legacy to bear and responsibility for doing that. But short of that, just a couple of thoughts. And the first one is, start by looking for allies. They're out there. And in fact, I would start by turning and saying, everyone is a potential ally. And then with that, work to build relationships, and real ones, not just transactional ones, not just a relationship of what can I get from you, but where are you? Where are you? Where are you coming from? What are your values? How do we connect? What are your stories? Can I tell you my stories? And build relationships and potential allies that way. We have a phrase that I use here in the graduate program, which is kind of stuck. And the phrase is relationships before transactions. That you think about that none of us like to be viewed as simply a transactional commodity. I mean, who does? And yet, when you're speaking with someone with whom you've had a prior relationship, even when you often disagree on a lot of things, you can build a relationship. There's one member of the North Carolina Environmental Management Commission who I will not embarrass by calling him out, but who's of a very different political bent from me in many different areas. But we have a relationship. He's somebody I can work with and talk to, and it has made a big difference in how certain issues got managed on the commission, and it really is important. So look for allies and assume that they're out there, and think about how to build relationships. So that's the first one. The second thing is to know your own power. People occasionally think they are powerless because you can't just sort of wave your arm and make something happen immediately, but people have tools of influence that they may not know that they have. There's a book that I teach in my applied sustainability class, and Nicole, I don't know if Dee Dee used that in the class when you took it, but it's called Influence Without Authority. And it's a great book. And the reason it's such a great book is because it actually takes this question head on and points out that in any relationship, there are all kinds of different tools, kind of different ways in which people exercise influence. And one useful way to do it when you're an advocate, especially, is to think about, what is the other person whom I'm trying to influence? What are their objectives? What are they trying to do? And what do they want? And what tools do I have that can affect their ability to achieve what they want? And when you start thinking of it that way and brainstorming about it, you realize you have more tools than you thought. Now, I hasten to add that I'm not naive about this, and that sometimes what other people want is irredeemably evil, and that you simply have to resist. But just because that happens sometime doesn't mean it happens all the time. And it's useful to start from a position of, what are they trying to achieve? Is there any good in it? And if so, how can I help influence things in a good way? And then the last point is to sort of repeat what I said earlier, which is it's really helpful if you're clear about what you want, and really specifically clear. And this is the value of campaigns for environmental justice, is that it is a very useful rallying cry and connects at a conceptual level some really important concepts. But specifically in a particular thing, that may mean I want this plant to stop having emergency startup, shutdown, and malfunction releases, or I want to eliminate truck traffic that's blocking our access, like in one community in South Carolina, that's blocking our access of communities to be people to be able to in and out of the community, or that we simply don't know you and we need to know you better. Or what we really need in this community is better streetlights. It can be a lot of different things. And so being clear about what you want as an advocate is really helpful. And to sort of, and then you have to ask yourself, that makes you ask yourself, why do I want this? And that's an important question to know too. So, and then a last point beyond that is that it's sometimes useful, and this speaks to our other thing about communication, to remember that the messenger can be as important as the message. There are communities where I would go in as a former EPA official, and just because I was a former EPA official, having nothing else there, will mean it's going to be really hard for me to communicate effectively with that community. But somebody else can go in and say the same things I would do, who is from a background that renders them more acceptable to that community, and they can reach that community in ways that I couldn't. And that's no reflection on me. That's just human nature. And so think about in your advocacy, identifying people who are going to be effective in a particular setting. I think, to Michael Regan's great credit, I think one of the reasons he got 69 votes for confirmation, which was remarkable, was because he was very effective in identifying, because of his background, with the agricultural community. That really mattered a lot to certain members of the Senate, where which otherwise would, in the agricultural community and EPA generally, have had a pretty fraught relationship. But because he was so effective in conveying that from his background, people responded to him very positively in that way.
Thank you. We didn't have any more questions in the chat. We did have a comment from Michelle. Understanding environmental justice issues as racial justice issues helps me understand why some environmental justice communities demand revolution and other communities aim for evolution, meeting people where they are. We have about 10 minutes left. Are there any other questions, any other thoughts that people would like to share, or things they'd like to ask?
And while people are thinking that, I just want to affirm Michelle's point, because that's exactly right. And these things are very much all bound up and together, that many of the issues involving environmental justice arise from issues of racial injustice. And North Carolina, especially, going all the way back to the Warren County landfill in 1987, and the work that Charles Lee with the United Church of Christ did in helping to highlight that particular action is a great example.
So I have one final question. So if there's somebody from a faith community on this call today, and they're like, okay, so I am totally on board, caretakers of creation, we can make a difference, we can advocate, and they go back to their church or faith community, what should they do? Like, what would be the first thing you'd say they could do? Let's say they're a church, they're not down with the efficient light bulbs, they haven't had an energy audit, they're not sure if they should really. Um, they have lots of property, but they don't really do anything with it. Um, what would they do?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. And Carl, you'll laugh when you hear this. Part of this is, first of all, to figure out who are your allies. Is there anybody else in the congregation who shares this concern? We, in the Diocese of Atlanta, one of the things we did was try to identify a creation steward in every congregation in the diocese. And we didn't get all of them, but we got a pretty good number. And then brought them together, because being in that role, in that prophetic role, if you will, can be a very lonely position. If you feel that you're out there sort of by yourself, that can be kind of lonely. But who are your allies? Is this something that your rector or your pastor, if you go talk to them about this, you may find that they share this or they have that same kind of concern. There may be the power of 2 or 3 gathered together is a really useful power, because sometimes the most important role of leadership is not the one exercised by the person who's out on the point. It's that second person who says, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do something about that. So building, it doesn't have to be a mass movement in a congregation. You get 2 or 3 people together, it's amazing. Who are committed to this, it's amazing what you can get done. And know that there are other people out there and resources that you can draw upon to find ways to do it. EPA has a website about congregational things that congregations can do. The Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta has a committee, and boy, if I would, and not the least of which would be get in touch with Carl Siegel. What they've done in Nativity is just awesome. So he can help give you examples of things that worked for them. So you find a few people, tell stories, find other stories, and share that way. So that's what I would do first.
And I would like to mention our website, zerowastechurch.org. We have a free downloadable ebook that you can obtain. It's called Restoring God's Earth, a Year of Personal Action. It's a couple years old now, but when we put it together, each month there are a number of actions that individuals and churches can take. And I think one of the things that really helps getting started is just stand up. We in 2017 for our Shrove Tuesday dinner, when we had over 110 people come for pancakes, we said, okay, everybody, we are going to use all compostable materials. We are not going to have any trash that's going to go to the landfill from this event. And there was silence in the room. What? Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, we had a small bag that I held up that had some things in it, mainly a glass pitcher that somebody had dropped and broken. And I said, this is all that's going to the landfill. And people stood up and cheered. So I think people want to do the right thing, and it makes them happy to do the right thing. And we've seen it over and over. Churches have taken on some of these actions. And so I would encourage everybody to, just get started, and you'll see you'll have lots of allies.
Well, that's a great story. It reminds me of something they do at the Hike Inn, which is in Georgia. It's at the you go about 5 miles in from Apalachicola State Park, and there's this thing there where you can reserve a stay. And because it's 5 miles in, and basically everything has to be carried in and out by foot there, they're really conscious about waste. And so what they do at dinner is they say, okay, this is a buffet dinner. Take what you want. However, we are going to have a contest. So at the end of the evening, we are going to have so we're going to see which table had the least food waste left over at the end of the meal. So it makes you think when you're going, so am I going to, and that's all they did. And then at the end of the evening, they posted which table had the best result and which table had the worst result. Well, that has a tremendous peer peer pressure effect, for you to take what you want so you're satisfied, but not to sort of just load up and then realize you've got too much food. Simple stuff like that can really be, that's a great thing that Carl did. And it's that same dynamic. You sort of get people to reframe what they're doing in ways that they then say, oh, well, I can think about this differently. And I want to respond to the question of, let's see, let me get into the chat here. It was a great question. From Michelle, and where do you find hope in the work being done these days? Well, I will admit that I find hope first at the national level in just the change of administration. The people who the Biden administration has brought in at the top of the organization, Gina McCarthy, Michael Regan, Janet McCabe, Brenda Mallory. I mean, these people are pros. And beyond that, even people whose names are not quite the household names that those folks are, they really did bring the A-team into the agency. And that by itself gives me tremendous hope. And you can feel that just in an organization, an EPA, that realizes, oh, people care. These people actually care about that. So that by itself gives me tremendous hope. But I don't put all my hope in government, even though I spent really a whole career doing government stuff. You see hope in the signs that financial organizations, people who manage trillions of dollars in the economy, are asking questions of corporations who are looking for money and for fundraising for that kind of thing, about asking questions about climate impact and sustainability. Just as companies are facing questions about larger issues of social responsibility that they never had to ask before. There is a system change, I think, at work there, where the old Milton Friedman, that the only responsibility of business is the stockholders, is breaking down at long last. So I find hope in those two things in particular. Now, it is fragile hope. I don't want to mistake that. And some of those signs in the private sector were going on even in the past administration. But how nice is it to have the government and business actually pushing in the same direction as opposed to pushing in different directions? So I take hope from all those things. And finally, I have the great privilege of being able to take hope from students, to the students that I teach, who are just amazing and who have a different way of thinking about this, and for whom climate change, just to pick on that one again, that's a thing for them that's going to be a thing when they're my age. And they know it. And they realize that that's a big responsibility. So those are some of the things I look for as hope.
All right. Well, thank you, Stan. We are down to our last 3 minutes. And I'm going to invite
and good to Michelle about we have power. That's my point. You
yes.
do. You have power that you don't even know you have.
Yes, absolutely. Any final words from anybody? Just want to make sure. We always try to end on time because people are like, yeah.
I appreciate that.
So Elizabeth, she's going to close us out today with a closing, and then we have kind of a PHW tradition where we let everybody unmute their mics and folks can say goodbye. And, if you're not in your pajamas and you want to say hello and you've been had your video turned off, you can say hello too. So Elizabeth.
Awesome. Well, I thought we would end with 3 deep breaths as a way to kind of ground ourselves and get in touch with kind of our bodies, but also the world around us. To Stan's point, we are all connected to the earth around us. So if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. If not, find a comfortable seat. Take your first deep breath in. And as you release, feel your body in the chair that you're in. Wiggle your toes. See how your feet are connected to the earth. With your second deep breath in, feel the oxygen come into your lungs and let it out. Release any stress that you might have been holding on to today. With your final deep breath, open your eyes and be open to what God has in store for you in this wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Stan. And thank everybody who was able to join us on the call. And
Have
you
a
can
good
unmute
weekend.
yourselves. You can say bye. We will have a recording and resources that were talked about. We'll send in a follow-up email.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
having me.
Hi, y'all are awesome.